Okay.
So should we start with a word of prayer first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll do that. I'll do it this time in English since we're in different. Okay. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for allowing us to be here together. Thank you for allowing us to do this teaching along with Professor Doug Tilstra and Professor Monique Vincent. And I pray that each of the students will benefit from what they'll hear today. And thank you for allowing our speaker today, Chandra Jordana, class of 2013, to be our guest speaker. In your name we pray, amen.
All right, well, welcome to this 1 o'clock session. This is one of our teach-in sessions at the conference. And it is, the title of the session is Equity Through a Different Lens. So this conference this week is being hosted by the Donald Blake Center at Walla Walla University, along with Adventist Health. And the question that we are asking this week is, what does equity look like? So you may have heard that term being used this week, and maybe you're not sure, right? What is equity? How is it different from equality? So pulling up a definition from George Washington University's public health program, it defines equality as something that means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So an important difference there between what it means to try and create equality and what it means to create equity. Our speakers so far this week, we've listened to Rebecca Parshell on Tuesday and Dr. David Williams yesterday evening on Wednesday, and they focused on what this system looks like here in our current place and time in 21st century America. With Dr. Williams, we looked even more specifically yesterday evening at the uneven impact of our current pandemic on different populations here in the United States. And this afternoon at 3:30, Dr. Donald Blake will talk about equity and respect for all people. So I am just introducing from the perspective of my history class that I'm teaching that usually meets at this time. And I see their faces here on the screen. It's good to see you. And this is a history class called The West and the World. In this quarter, we're looking at pretty much 18th to 21st century history in Europe and its interactions with the rest of the world. And a big part of our class is studying the ideas of the past that have shaped who we are today. We've been looking at the origins of our modern society this week in the 19th century. We've looked at the political revolutions that argue for the liberty and equality of each human being. We've also looked at the Industrial Revolution, which creates an entirely new economy and society, but also a lot of new disparities. For today, the students in my class read about the Irish potato famine of the mid-19th century. And this is a time when political and economic beliefs, as well as ethnic and religious prejudice, led to inaction in the starvation or displacement of some 3 million people. So we're learning how the ideologies, these beliefs that we hold, play a key role in how we as humans decide to act or not act. Next week, we're going to be looking at the origins of racism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So for those who look around and say, why do inequalities exist, right? Why do different people have different experiences? At this time in the 19th, early 20th centuries, the ideology of racism provided a very popular answer. So racism in this time period was the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, distinct abilities, qualities that distinguish some races as superior and some as inferior. So racism said that people like the Europeans were more advanced because they were racially superior. So these beliefs were then used to justify European imperialism, which we're also going to be talking about. Europeans colonized, they occupied, and they exploited other people and their land because they were spreading their so-called superior civilization. So this attitude of superiority, this attitude of justified privilege has shaped the world that we live in today, and it contributes to the inequities, the inequalities that we see around us and are part of some of our experiences. So I've asked my students for today for this discussion and invite all of us to be willing to listen as a first step to trying to visualize equity. So Professor Alfaro will now introduce our guest speaker, who's sharing his view of equity through a different lens.
Thank you. So Chana Urdana is a 2013 graduate of Walla Walla University Communications and Languages Department, having double major in international communications and Spanish. Chandler has worked in the nonprofit sector since his graduation from Walla Walla University, having served as a member of the board of directors for many organizations and working in both administrative and client-facing roles. Chandler also has a master's degree in international affairs and global enterprise from the University of Utah, and is a multilingual, multicultural professional who has lived and worked in 6 different countries. He's passionate about writing, comedy, and traveling. Thank you, Chandler, for coming to our class today. And after his talk, we're gonna have a Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Just to make sure on some of the specifics, how this goes to 150, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is it okay to make a more kind of interactive talk where students can maybe type questions into the chat box, or would it be best to hold that till the end?
Oh, it's up to you. You are you're in charge of this part. Like, just let us know and we'll work that out.
Okay, so just kind of the style that I like to present would be, if anyone has questions or feedback, comments on anything that I'm saying, feel free to just probably type it into the chat box would be easiest. And then it can be addressed kind of as the presentation is going along, or you can feel free to ask that later on if that works best for you. So I'll go ahead and
You can also unmute themselves and ask the question directly if they would like.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so in my, I saw the Donald Blake Center was described as, bringing in, I guess, leading academics in the field. I just want to qualify this with I am not. I'm a professional in the field though. And so I'm just going to kind of be speaking a lot, drawing on my own experience. As has been said, my name is Chandler Jordana. I'm a 2013 graduate of Walla Walla University of the Common Language Department. And in 2017, I received my master's from the University of Utah in International Affairs. And I've worked in the nonprofit sector since then, predominantly in refugee and migration issues. And so, a lot of what I'm discussing has kind of been my own experience. And, as it is kind of a social science area, it's not, it's up for discussion. So, feel free to push back on ideas I present, or, that's how we learn. So, so I'm going to be discussing the inequities in the immigration system. And so, the Donald Blake Center promotes inclusiveness, multiculturalism, social justice, these types of ideals. And, immigration is a very, I guess, hot topic, you could say right now, for lack of a better term. And I would like to discuss how, the federal immigration policy displays really neither equality nor equity. And so yeah, people have probably seen this photo, pretty basic explanation of what equality is versus equity. I guess it didn't load it loaded quite pixelated into my presentation. So I'm gonna look at equity as being, or equity is, the quality of being fair and impartial. So in other words, perhaps giving opportunities to those who don't inherently have such opportunities, or I guess kind of leveling the playing field is the way that I look at equity. Versus equality is just, okay, making sure everyone kind of gets the same, equal in status, rights, and opportunities. And I like that wording because, the United States is supposedly founded on, the principles of equality. So status, rights, and opportunities. And I'm going to kind of discuss how, in my experience, that's not as much the case, perhaps. So the first thing I want to discuss is why do people immigrate? So there's a, well, I guess the first thing that I'd like to say is, there's, I believe it's 98 to 99% of this country are immigrants, and the 1 to 2% would be native populations. So really, the vast majority of our country are immigrants, but we don't often perceive ourselves in that way. And whether it was our generation, our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, great grandparents, et cetera, and as I think I think the Native American population is currently, I think 1.3% is the last estimate I saw. So 98.7% of us are immigrants, somewhere along our family tree. And what are the reasons that that people immigrate? And I would really emphasize, there's some reasons that are there, poverty, hunger, war, escape. I think the main theme with the reasons that people immigrate is security. Whether that's physical security, whether there's war, famine, so some sort of physical or existential threat that's present in their life that that necessitates immigration to a safer place, or even economic security, the economic opportunities that the United States, for example, presents versus other countries mostly in our hemisphere and around the world as well. There's really not a comparison, and so I think a lot of the times when we hear a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, or those that would promote a more, I guess, closed immigration system, I don't know if they're fully putting themselves in the shoes of the other people, and they're definitely not looking at this through a lens of equity. And I noticed that some of the discussions that were or some of the presentations from this week centered around kind of how COVID has laid bare the inequities that are already present. I think that a lot of those inequities have already been have been present for a long time for immigrants, people of color, these types of populations. But I think COVID-19 has really exacerbated that. And in my current employer, we work predominantly with Latino populations, and there's just been a lot of data and a lot of reporting on how this has been one of the most adversely affected populations during the pandemic. Whether that's higher infection rates, higher economic impact. And so when there's something that comes that affects the entire population, that's typically felt more among certain populations. And I can't really address all the specifics of everything I'm going to talk about in such a short time frame. But if anyone is really interested in these topics, I'd be happy to follow up with them afterwards as well and give some very specific examples. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own background and experience as how it pertains to equity, because everyone obviously has their own lens or bias with which they approach these types of topics. And so I'm the son of a formerly undocumented immigrant. So my father came to the U.S. from the Philippines by way of Canada in the 1980s, and and that gave me a kind of a unique personal lens at which to view immigration, and especially kind of the inequities of the system, because my father was a relatively privileged immigrant. My grandfather was a diplomat. My father was predominantly, he was multiracial, but a significant European background there. Had a lot of economic advantages, such as an education that a lot of immigrants don't have. Also came during a period when I think that the kind of general sentiment was our country was a lot more immigrant friendly. And so, I got to, I guess, experience, I didn't personally experience, but I guess kind of vicariously through his experience, what that looked like. I mean, he was a formerly undocumented person in Canada and the United States. And and so he had a lot of, like I said, a lot of privileges that other immigrants don't have, and I'm cognizant of that. But also there was, I even remember as a child, like sometimes my dad would have me as a child talk on the phone to people because he thought people would judge him because of his accent. And this is a privileged immigrant, has high education, works in business, like kind of the more, I guess, someone that some anti immigrant groups might consider, a more desirable group. And so after I graduated from Walla Walla, I became somewhat intimately familiar with the Syrian refugee crisis. I went to work in Beirut for a year, and that certainly affected my career goals and what I wanted to do. So when I came back to the U.S., I wanted to work more face to face with a lot of these populations, and so I worked for 2 years. I helped refugees get employment, and I also it was a nonprofit, so we worked in kind of some case management aspects as well. And that's when I really became very a lot of these topics became a lot more personal to me. It was during a time when there was when I started working in refugee issues, it was not really a controversial subject. It was something that everyone agreed upon. The UN had kind of necessitated that countries take on a certain amount of refugees. Then it became polarized in a very controversial issue, almost seemingly overnight. And I was working with a lot of populations from Democratic Republic of Congo, from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Somalia, a lot of countries that have dealt with a lot of turmoil. I'll discuss that a bit later on. But yeah, I remember distinctly in 2017 attending a rally that was pro refugee, and one of the prominent speakers at that rally said, these people are here legally, they've kind of done things the right way, et cetera, et cetera. And at that time, I didn't question it that much. It wasn't until later on in my career, such as with my current employer, we worked with a lot of undocumented people, that I really began to question that narrative. And especially you can look at it, through a lens of equity, because rarely when we discuss immigration do we look at it through a lens of equity or what's right, or even justice, especially social justice, or through a lens of inclusivity. And so I think that the narrative on kind of desirable groups of immigrants, I put that in quotes because I don't really believe in that, but it's people that can be productive, people that are escaping wars or legitimate reasons, which I think that the narrative for even who is a refugee is established by international groups that there's lobbyists, there's background there that for example, there's some countries that the UN recognizes refugees from those countries that perhaps the situation is actually not as dire as it is in some of the countries that we see a lot of asylum seekers from right now in Central America, and a lot of the situations. So these kind of international regimes are it's difficult though. It gets a bit muddy, but I just want you to think about these types of terms as what makes one immigrant desirable or good versus one that's perhaps not as politically convenient for some politicians. So I just want to talk a little bit about the examples of the root causes of immigration. So kind of using my own experience as examples. So currently in my current position, the vast 95% of our clients are from Mexico and Central America. And so I want to just, and again, I don't have time really to go in depth on all of this, but I'm happy to provide examples of this for anyone who would, skipped ahead a slide. So Mexico's economic independence. So obviously Mexico is heavily dependent on the United States economically. The top three sources of revenue for Mexico in regards to GDP, the first would be oil. The second would be money sent from Mexicans living in the US to Mexico. And the third would be tourism, which is primarily from the United States. And also, the United States benefits a lot from cheap labor from Mexican immigrants. So just taking one example, probably a lot of you are from California. So if you take the Central Valley as an example. So the Central Valley provides 25% of the nation's food, including 40% of fruits, vegetables, more whole, unprocessed food. And the Central Valley is made up of 75–80% immigrant labor, and a lot of those are undocumented individuals. These statistics are inherently difficult to to gather, because undocumented populations oftentimes don't want to be counted in things like census for obvious reasons. But so it's almost on a macro scale, the policies that are being purported is almost to we want to benefit from the cheap labor. We want to benefit from from in a lot of instances, Mexican populations and immigrants. We want the benefits, but we don't want to actually give them decent lives in the countries in which they're, in the situation in which they're helping us. So it's just, it's not a very equitable situation. Also, if you look at Central America, there's a lot of immigration from El Salvador right now. And if you look at, El Salvador's war from 1979 to 1992, there was overt CIA involvement in that, and that's well documented. It's not some fringe conspiracy theory, or and a lot of these we kind of create a cycle of these things. We see the consequences later on. So we're still seeing the consequences of things that happened 30 years ago happening now, or coming to roost now, whatever term you want to use. The violence in Honduras, for example. So a lot of the violence in Honduras is caused by the MS-13 gangs, the 18th Street Barrio gangs. These gangs were started in Los Angeles in the 70s and the 80s with a lot of, some immigrants were imprisoned, and they started these gangs in prison, and then they were deported to Honduras. So this is, a lot of the times the United States is actually, directly or indirectly involved in creating the situations that perpetuate and necessitate immigration. And, this is not really discussed a lot in the public narrative. Also, the United States has been involved in Honduras since 1954 in the coup d'etat. So there's really, the migration from Mexico and Central America, in not discounting local factors, of which you can't say the U.S. is the only reason that these types of things happen, but there's certainly a lot of historical covert operations, overt operations, CIA involvement. The U.S. kind of taking advantage of a lot of these countries for our own benefit, and then from a federal policy, not really allowing people to come in and seek refuge in our country from problems that we created, frankly. And then, so let's look at a lot of countries with high numbers of refugees in the U.S. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you go to Afghanistan as well, you can look at the roots of that. So during the Cold War, the United States actively funded what would later become Al-Qaeda to fight the Soviets. And so that's a problem that they're still seeing now, that we created essentially. And the war in Iraq, you can discuss what the actual motivation was there, but it's difficult to not see that the situation in Iraq is worse now after that. And I've talked to a lot of Iraqis, and they say things like, well, I didn't like Saddam either, but it's better than what we have now. And so, that's US involvement in a lot of the people fleeing violence that was created by the United States. So a lot of times there's this narrative of we can take care of our homeless, or let's take care of these people first before we take in refugees, before we take in immigrants. And I would argue, again, you're welcome to push back on this, but I think a more pacifist view or way of interacting with the world would actually, kind of foster an environment where we don't have these types of problems to begin with. There's also a lot of US involvement in Somalia. If anyone's seen the movie Black Hawk Down, that's like a reference to pop culture. The CIA coup in Iran. Iran is a great example. So the Shah, which was basically a dictator in the 50s, the United States and British intelligence at that time overthrew him. And directly, again, to get into the very specifics of this, and the history would take some time. But long story short, the Shah was basically propped up by the United States government in response to Mohammed Siddiqui, which was a democratically elected kind of a nationalist. And this bothered the United States and Britain due to geopolitical positionings at that time. And so they propped up the Shah, who was a dictator essentially, but he was a Western friendly dictator. And so this is the direct result of the situation in Iran right now. We're seeing that right now from the coup that was caused by the CIA and British intelligence. And this was not common information for a while, but it's happened so long ago now that this is proof. I mean, there's you can't deny this. There's evidence for it. It's not some fringe conspiracy theory. And then, if you look at Venezuela and Cuba, for example, so Venezuela, there are 300,000 people that lack access to medicines, basic medicines. I mean, these are people that have diabetes, that need insulin, very basic medicine to live. And this is largely caused by U.S. sanctions that are placed on Venezuela. And I'm not gonna advocate for the government that's currently in Venezuela and say they're doing a great job by any means. But you also can't discount the effect of U.S. sanctions as the kind of global economic superpower and the effect that it has on this. So another narrative you hear a lot on immigration. It seems my screen maybe froze. I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 second to try and fix that. Okay, it's back. 1 sec. Okay. Okay, so a lot of people say things like, well, why can't they just come legally, right? And I don't think people really realize how difficult or how lengthy of a process that is. So you can see here, even just fully reading this cartoon would take a while, but okay, so you can see, do you have family in the US? No. Are you skilled? Okay, you could say no. You have virtually zero shot of coming to the United States if you have no family in the US and you're not considered a skilled labor, which even that term is subjective. What does it mean to be skilled labor? Who defines that? So if you say, okay, yes, I'm skilled, do you have a college degree or specialty application? Okay, then you have a shot. Do you have a job offer? No. So even if you are skilled, in many instances, you don't qualify. So if you are skilled, I mean, if you look at the category, it's basically, are you a genius? Are you a star athlete? Do you have at least $1 million? So really, I mean, if we look at equity in its purest sense of the word, of being fair and impartial, I think that it would be very difficult to argue that this system is fair and impartial. We've essentially, what we've done is we've created an immigration system. Oh, sorry, as you can see there, that basically favors wealth, skill. Equality is a footnote. It's a talking point. It's not really something that policymakers seem to be that interested in. And a lot of times this is discussed in a partisan frame, as though, vote for Democrats, they'll care more about immigrants. And I would argue that this is really more a talking point than the reality, because a lot of the policies that Trump just followed what Obama did in a lot of instances. There's been some good legislation, such as DACA, for example, but it's really putting a Band-Aid on the situation and not really solving it. And granted, it's not a lot of people, when they discuss a topic such as immigration, they say, well, why don't you just do X, or why don't you do Y? The reality is that it's a very complex issue. It's multifaceted. It's not something that's, you can easily solve immigration, for example. But I would just when people discuss immigration and they discuss what's fair and they discuss what's equitable, and they say things like, oh, well, so-and-so waited 15 years, or my ancestors did this legally, or, really push back and think of the narrative of legality versus morality versus equity versus justice versus what's right. Because the United States is unique in its position as a truly multicultural country. It's one of the only countries in the world that, from the very onset, and we could even go back to the onset of modern America and how unjust that the creation of that was. But leaving that topic for a different day, that's one of our core values. And really, even if you look at the presidential debates in, say, the 1980s, candidates were essentially trying to outdo themselves as to who could be more humane or who could appear more welcoming to immigrants. It's kind of a recent phenomenon that there's been this, really anti-immigrant rhetoric and actions as well. And so I guess what I would put on the students in the class is sorry, I think this is a group of different students, not just one class. How do you create a more equitable immigration system, and what should immigration reform look like? And now would be a great time. I could keep talking if you'd like, but now would be a great time for some questions or for comments or for any thoughts. If anyone has anything, has there been anything that else? Can probably stop sharing my screen for a second. I don't see anything in the chat. So, okay, yeah. So I would argue that a more humane and a more, I guess, equitable immigration system might look like, so there can be, I think that there can be two steps taken. I think that there has to be a clear path to citizenship or at least legal residency for those, for a lot of groups that makes sense. There's people that have, I have someone tell me that's a difficult question. It is a difficult question. And I think just a lot of the way you can do with this narrative is just recognizing that it's a difficult question. Because we live in a kind of a society that has very collectively short attention spans. And I think that we want quick answers and we want 5-minute clips. And the reality is that it's a complex issue, and you have to look at the history, you have to look at the roots, and you have to really look at this through a more equitable lens to start getting some actual answers. But in my opinion, there's two steps that can be taken. And like I said, the first would be being a clear path to citizenship or at least legal residency for many folks. And I think that starts at programs and resources for people crossing the border illegally, rather than incarceration, deportation. And this goes for people that are fleeing poverty or violence. Because I think a lot of the times we view that people fleeing violence is a justifiable reason, but fleeing extreme poverty is not a justifiable reason, when the reality is that both of these constitute existential threats. I mean, I don't see how there could be much argument to that. But okay, I got a few questions. Thank you for those of you who have sent questions. Do I believe background checks and denying immigration towards individuals known to be violent should be in use? Okay, so my answer to that, I guess, would be what do you define as violence? Because a lot of the times, I think if you look at people's criminal records in their own countries, they could be declared a violent person for participating in a protest or some form of political dissidence, or so I think that I don't think as a society it's in anyone's best interest to have violent people, murderers, rapists, these types of people just free. I think they should be obviously separated from society, and the discussion on incarceration, that's a completely separate issue. But sorry,
can I elaborate on that question a
Yeah.
little bit? Do you believe that, like, for example, say there was an individual from Iran or Iraq, Afghanistan that was known to previously be in, like, say Al-Qaeda or something,
Sure.
just like theoretically, do you believe, knowing that history, that they were violent towards the US soldiers, do you believe they should still be granted citizenship or be allowed to immigrate to the United States?
No, in a case like that, if they're a terrorist, then no.
Right.
But I think that Iraq and Afghanistan are one of the countries that the UN recognizes as legitimate refugees.
Mhm.
And so the vetting process that refugees have to go through is extreme. I mean, like years and years of background checks. It's very difficult. And I mean, like extremely difficult to infiltrate the refugee system and then resettle in the United States as someone that has committed, a heinous crime such as that. It's extremely difficult.
So then how do you believe we should draw that line on, like, okay, we should allow these people in, but not these people? Because you kind of said, like, yeah, if someone's prone to violence in their country, they may not be so much in the United States. But how do you draw that line and make it fair?
Sure, yeah. So what I was referencing is, I don't mean violence as far as like violent acts against, another individual. I mean more like, because I've seen in instances that you can get a criminal record, or you can be seen as a violent person for, being a political dissident, for example, because a lot of people are fleeing countries that are tyrannical. And so I don't think that necessarily the reference for that of using like a criminal record from another, because I guess I'd question the validity of that criminal record. But again, I also would like to point out, I don't claim to have all the answers or to be the person that should necessarily be making the policy on this, or, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that's an interesting discussion. And I do think that we have to think about these things in different ways. And I appreciate your question. I would say that, it's, I think even like Canada, for example, has a better immigration system, but there's really there's no country in the world that has, quote, figured this out. My personal opinion, and this is kind of the two-tier approach to what I think there has to be more explicit recognition of the United States government's role in creating these problems. To me, to really solve the problem, you have to go to the root of a problem. And I think if you ask the vast majority of immigrants, I would say 90% plus, most of them probably would have honestly preferred to remain in their country if they could have been guaranteed, livable wage, security. The majority of immigrants don't want to leave their country. That's the culture that they know. That's the customs that they know. Their family's there. That's where they grew up. That's the language that they speak. There's a quote that says, "No one leaves home unless home is this mouth of a shark." I'm not saying that, you do have instances where, for example, a violent person or someone that wants to do harm, or, that's just humanity. There's bad people in humanity. But I think that we have to change the narrative of how we talk about immigration, because we often talk about, okay, what do we do? They're at our border. What do we do? Do we let them all in? Do we not let anybody in? What do we do? And I think if we really, from a policy perspective, want to begin to address the issue, you have to address the root of the issue. So you first would have to say, okay, what do we do with the people that have been here for X number of years? There's people that are deported to Mexico, for example, that don't even speak Spanish. They grew up in the United States. This is the only country they've ever known. I think that a lot of those people should be given citizenship, legal residency. So, okay, so what do we do with the people that are already here? Okay, from that point, then what do we do? Towards a more like, just immigration policy or equitable immigration policy? And I think a big step would be, and, I don't know if this is even in the best interest of the federal government or how realistic this is for them to do something like this. But I think that there has to be an explicit recognition of we're complicit in a lot of these crimes that are sending people to the United States. And I think to really solve the problem, you can't really address it without addressing that. So I know it's not a yes or no or one sentence answer, but hopefully that kind of begins to address what you asked.
Yeah, thanks for your opinion on that.
No worries. Thanks for the question.
I have a question here.
So you say that like a lot of the issues come from the United States, intervening in other countries. Right now in the international community, I think a lot of people just see like, the United States as the world's police force. Do you think that should change?
Definitely.
Because a lot of people just say, oh, why aren't the Americans doing something to help these people? And so should we just, like, say from the very beginning, just, not get involved at all?
So again, I think that's a difficult question too. But so one thing that actually made me think of my own perspective, I worked briefly for an NGO that did work in Afghanistan, and I spent a few weeks in Kabul in Afghanistan, and I was talking to one of my colleagues there, and I asked him directly. I was like, "What do you think about the presence of our troops in Afghanistan? Like, do you think that is something that should happen?" And I told him, I will proclaim this. I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in war unless it's absolutely 100% inevitable. That's my personal opinion, so that influences my opinions. Again, you're welcome to push back. I don't pretend to have a monopoly on knowledge, but that's my opinion. So in regards to your question, as like the US is the world police force, I asked him and I said, I don't think that the troops should be here. I don't think we have any business being here. I don't think it's helpful. And he said, I actually really like that you all are here, because if you weren't here, it would be Pakistan, it would be Iran, it would just be someone else. And to me, that is the single greatest argument for the US having the large military presence that it does, is the fact that if it wasn't us, it would be China, it would be Russia, it would be somebody else. And that's just kind of the way that history has gone. There's always you've always had a hegemony. You've always had some kind of global superpower, you know, whether it was Rome, whether it was the British Empire, whether it was the Spanish Empire for a while. That's just the way Western history and civilization has kind of worked. But I would argue that I don't think that, you know, obviously I think you need a military. What I would advocate for is less spending on the military and a more, I guess, because the U.S. has military bases in all over the world, in excess, in my opinion. I think that we could probably cut our military budget in half. And again, don't quote me on this because I would have to do more research, but I think we could probably cut the military budget in half and still have the largest military in the world. So I think that I would advocate for diminishing military presence, not eliminating it. But again, really, I would encourage people to watch the documentary Dirty Wars. It's by one of my favorite journalists. His name's Jeremy Scahill, and he talks about this more in depth. So in addressing your question about the US as the world's police force, I don't think that's the US's job. I think a lot of the times, perhaps we as the American people are sold a more, and I think a lot of the people that go to fight these wars as well, are sold a more benevolent reason and mission as far as, you know, Operation Iraqi Freedom. We're going to go free the Iraqi people. Look at Iraq now. I don't think it's in a better situation. And, you know, what the actual motivation of those that are calling these shots are, will we ever know that? Or will they ever give a straight answer? So I guess to answer your question, I would say that I don't think it's the US's job to police the world. I do believe that, you know, military presence is necessary, but not to the extent that we have it. And, you know, sorry, I can't give super straight answers because it's kind of complex topics, but hopefully that answers a little bit.
And so if it's not going to be war, it's probably going to be sanctions, and you've got an issue against that. So what would your, I guess, right now, like as an opinion, what would your like go-to almost like intervention would be?
Okay. Could you give like a specific example so I could?
But yeah, you were talking about Venezuela earlier, and how the US sanctions against them are, you know, hurting like you know, medicinal supplies and all that.
Mhm.
So instead of that, what would you, like, in your opinion, would it should have?
I mean, if it's no direct threat to us, just let them be. Or no direct threat to other countries, or, you know, like, you don't have to agree with everyone. You don't have to agree with Nicolas Maduro to let him govern his country. You know, I don't think Maduro is a good leader at all. I wouldn't vote for him if that was a possibility. I don't want to, you know, come across as someone that supports him. But at the same time, I'm not Venezuelan. Why is that my business? And that's my personal opinion.
So would you say that, you know, maybe it's not like, you know, the global culture saying just ask the Americans for help whenever they're, you know, you're under a tyrannical government or something?
In a way, I think that's a kind of a false narrative, to be honest. I've been fortunate to travel pretty extensively, and I've had strangers come up to me in the Middle East and say, "Oh, are you American?" And I was like, "Oh, here we go." And they've said things like, "I love Americans. You guys are great. I just hate your government." I've had, you know, people just come up to me and say that, and you know, I'm not trying to offend anyone with any of these views or anything, but I just I love America too. I live here. I just would change some things about our government if I could.
Okay.
Gracias. So we have Micah, but there are also other comments in there, but Micah, you wanna talk?
Yeah, I was just kind of gonna disagree as a former military member. You know, our income when we were active duty is not exactly very great. I'm sure Professor Alfaro or Dr. Vincent probably make more money than what I made when I was active duty. So I agree with the people in chat that when I was in the Navy, private companies get paid a ridiculous amount of money for their goods. I worked with computer networks and stuff like that. So I know like the ridiculous amount that we paid for PCs. And I think that is part of the problem with why our budget is so big, but I don't know how you're going to change that. But I would definitely not like if the budget was decreased, especially when I was active. But I do agree with you that it is more than it should be, but it also has to do with the private corporations.
Sure.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. With my time in the Navy, because I was in the Navy, we spent entirely too much money on stupid shit because they made contracts with private companies. instead of actually paying the people. But I made nothing. My lowest paying year was $23,000. My highest paying year was only 34.
Sure. So I appreciate both of your comments, and I did think that there would probably be some former military members in the servicemen in the discussion. And first of all, I should have made that more clear. I'm not against people that have served in the military. I'm against the military-industrial complex. And also, I think that you kind of both hit the nail on the head, actually, and we might agree more than we think. And also, I welcome discourse and people that disagree. That's kind of the foundation of democracy. But I think that the military budget is too large and horribly misappropriated or like the fact that there are these private companies, the fact that there are these mercenaries. I don't think that there's, soldiers out there making millions off of fighting war. I don't believe that at all. But there are people that are definitely making millions off of fighting war. And there are people like Halliburton, defense contractors, these types of people are getting rich off of war. And it's not, the person that's going to actually fight it. So thank you for your comments. I appreciate that. I'll just try to address some of these that are in the chat box. Do you think there's a current immigration system that stands out as equitable? In preparation for this talk last night, I actually did some research, and kind of the whole world kind of sucks at this, to be honest. The one that I looked at that makes a little bit more sense to me is Canada, but there's not, and I think that this is somewhat a problem of our time / something that's quite modern, just to the ease with which people can actually move from place to place, and the fact that there is kind of an uptick in reasons to migrate. If you look at pre-World War II to now, so this is I think this is a relatively because in regards to like Western civilization, a relatively new issue, but there's not really, an immigration system that I stand out and look at, oh, wow, if we could only be more like X. But I think Canada's probably doing a little better. Let's see. Okay, from Josh. As you pointed out, the process to immigrate is extremely hard and expensive. Why don't we see more effort being put toward making it easier, quicker, and cheaper to immigrate? That's a great question. And I agree with you. I think it shouldn't be so difficult to immigrate. And I think that the system, proponents of more immigration and people that think that less people should immigrate, I don't think there would be a lot of argument that the system isn't broken. I think that everyone can agree that the system is broken, it's dated, and it needs updating. How much different is our immigration process to that of other countries? Isn't it supposed to be hard to immigrate because it makes it harder for bad people to come in? I'm not against good people coming, but I don't see how making it easier to get into the country wouldn't bring as many bad people in the proportion to the good. So, okay, so my response to that question would be, these are a lot of ambiguous terms. What makes someone bad? What makes someone good? I think what you're referring to is like, criminal record or demonstrable history that someone has. I work with a lot of people that believe in 100% open borders. I don't think that I necessarily ascribe to that, but I do, because I think that, for example, I don't think it's in our best interest to, let murderers into the country, but, there are murderers here as well. So I'm not against, like some sort of security, but I do think that we need to think about things like, I guess this would get into a larger discussion about the incarceration rates and, the prison industrial complex, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I guess that, I would just question those kind of terms, as like, what makes someone bad? What makes someone good? Who deserves second chances? Who doesn't? It does seem that the immigration system is inequitable and favoring the wealthy, but what would be the solution to this problem? The US subsidizing the process, the US subsidizes a lot of other useless processes internally. Okay, so Taylor, this is a good question as well. I think that just the amount of misspending from the government is a problem. I think we talked about military budgets. Those that have been in the military can attest to this, as they have, that the money's not necessarily allocated well. I think a lot of our tax money is not allocated well. And I think that even, again, this would, I guess, foster into a larger discussion, but a lot of the foreign aid that we give to other countries as well doesn't actually help as much as it's supposed to because of who it goes to. and because of corrupt governance in other countries. So I think that, we'd really have to look at these things with a more examining eye to really get that answer. But thank you for that question. Okay, so what is fair? What I believe is fair is not what someone else would believe to be fair. So the definition of fair is always up for debate. 100% correct. Also, in regards to your statement that America gains from cheap labor, I would argue that the corporations are the ones who gain, not the entire nation. Yeah, that's a valid point. I think there are some, like smaller businesses and whatnot that gain from corporation. One thing that I would say is whenever they do these kind of busts on undocumented folks, it seems like they're always punishing the undocumented people and not the people that hired them. And so that to me doesn't seem very equitable. How do you?
Sorry to interrupt. We have another class coming in.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the students and everybody who joined to listen and to also participate in the discussion. For this class, remember you're writing a response. I posted the information online. Thank you, Chandler, and looking forward to hearing more from you soon in the future.
Yeah, no problem. So I put my email in the chat. If anybody wants to discuss any of this further, I'm happy to do that. So yeah, thank you all for your time and for your questions. And again, I'm happy to have discourse on this. You don't have to agree with me.
The immigration process is really long. I can say that on my behalf. My father, it took 15 years, and he's a lawyer in El Salvador. It took 15 years. And yeah, to get all the paperwork. So yeah, it is a long process. And then if there's a visa bulletin, if you go in there, you can see the many years, depending where you're coming from, so there are quotas on that. Yeah. Gracias, thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Profe,
Yes, Micah?
are you going to your office after this?
Yes. So I'll talk
Okay.
to
Okay, thank you.
you.
The Blake Center is in charge of this Zoom call, right?
Yeah, they're the ones recording it, and